Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I may introduce our illustrious moderator for this afternoon, Patricia Ellen. She is CEO of Global Healthcare and Innovation Company, Optum. Previously, she was at McKinsey, where she was a partner and worked there for 18 government. Without further ado, Patricia, thank you.
Obrigada, Diego. Bom, boa tarde.
Diego. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great honor to be here with you in such an important discussion for Brazil. This session will be held in Portuguese. Since most of us are Brazilians, we're going to be speaking Portuguese, but in case you do not speak Portuguese, you can use the simultaneous translation devices.
Running the session in Portuguese because most of all the speakers here are Portuguese speakers. Então, para a gente começar, o tema aqui é como é que a gente pode revigorar.
So let's start. The topic of today's session is Reinvigorating Brazil's Investment Climate. Let me introduce the panelists. They are public figures, I'm sure all of you know them, but I will introduce them. First, we have the mayor of São Paulo, João Doria. He was a Minister of Tourism, he was the Secretary of Tourism for São Paulo, he's president of Doria Associates, and he's been our mayor since 2016. Also, Ambassador Roberto Jaguaribe, who holds a BS in System Engineering by the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. He was the Brazilian ambassador for China, for the United Kingdom, and he's also worked in the Brazilian embassy in Washington as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's currently the Apex president. We also have Mr. Candido Bracher, who holds a master's degree in business by the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. He's BBA co-founder, and since 2017, he's held the position of CEO from Itaú Unibanco Bank. He's also a member of the board of directors of Santa Cruz School. Also, Mr. Arminio Fraga, who holds a PhD in economy by the Princeton University. He's currently the co-founder of Gávea Investimentos, but he was also the president of the Brazilian Central Bank. So to kick off our panel, I will give you a brief introduction on the topic. After that, I'm going to give the floor to each and every one of our panelists with specific questions. You will each have 5 minutes to answer these questions. I ask you to kindly respect this 5-minute time frame, because after that, we're going to have a Q&A session. So the audience will have the opportunity of posing questions to the panelists. So to start our panel on investments in Brazil, first and foremost, a very important thing is to understand our current context. Some people may say that we are now in a positive environment in the country, since we've been through a crisis and a recession over the past years in Brazil. And some examples we can give in terms of foreign investment in Brazil. Figures reach $70 million as of today. We have 40% of the FDI that comes to Brazil, and over the past decades, we've been among the 10 or 15 countries that receive the most amount of foreign direct investment around the globe. On the other hand, we do face some challenges. We've had 2 investment peaks in Brazil, one in 2011, one in 2014. We've gone through a huge recession in some specific years, namely 2015 and 16, when investments started to reduce. And back in 2016, we started our recovery, and in 2017, we've seen a great scenario as the year ended. And this scenario became even more positive in the beginning of 2018. So the goal here in this session is to learn from our panelists what their take is in 3 specific topics. First, what is the current scenario and what is the take on foreign investors? Are we really recovering? Second question, if we are actually recovering and we do have some challenges, what can we do so as to strengthen the investment environment in Brazil? And thirdly, I want to invite you all to reflect upon the topic of this forum, a new narrative for Latin America. Considering the fourth industrial revolution scenario, how can we in Brazil play a pivotal role in this fourth industrial revolution with investments in technology, with higher added value, and therefore increase the economic complexity of the country? This is a scenario we're going to talk about in this panel. And my first question is about, yes, we do have foreign investment in Brazil. We are improving, but of course there are some challenges that need to be faced. The World Economic Forum will release a report on competitiveness in Brazil as of today. Tomorrow we will have a debate on that, and in the last report that included 137 countries, Brazil was in the 80th position. And challenges were quite clear. First has to do with the macroeconomic environment, infrastructure, and the role of institutions in Brazil, as well as innovation in the Brazilian environment. Another important indicator we know is the e-business indicator. So what we have in the business environment today and what can we do to improve. With that, I want to give the floor to Mayor João Doria to kick off this discussion with us. Can you please bring us some context on the city of São Paulo? Mayor, you have said that one of your goals is to make São Paulo a global city. So I'd like to hear from you. Can you give us some examples on what has gone about? What have you done to attract more investments in Brazil and what challenges we have to address, please? Thank you, Patricia. Mr. Arminio, Mr. Candido, and Jaguaribe, it is a pleasure to be with you today. I'm sorry, I apologize for my voice. About doing business. Patricia, one of the things we have to consider is that São Paulo is a benchmark when we think of doing business index. When we took over the office in January last year, meaning less than 15 months ago, I was scared about the position of Brazil. It was 154th place in the Doing Business Index, and I was truly ashamed when I saw that. We're among the worst countries in the world, and that happens because the index in São Paulo portrayed a very sad reality. To open up a company up until May last year, it took 126 years. That was 4 months to open up a company. That was ridiculous. So what we did was to put together a team along with the federal government, along with SEBRAE, along with the Brazilian mayor team, with Endeavor Institute and other institutes, and in less than 4 months, we managed to put together a platform. And since June 1st last year, and let me remind you, we took over the office in January. By June, we managed to reduce this time frame to 5 days. So we went from 120 days to 5. And as of July 1st this year, this number will be reduced to 2 days only. And since January next year, it will take only 1 day to open up a company in Brazil. So yes, this index will improve. I'm sure this is not the only reason why we had this bad position in the list, but of course, that will help us climb up this position. And it is unbelievable to think of São Paulo as a city that has a natural willing for business. It was really unacceptable to ask entrepreneurs to wait for 120 days to open up their own companies. Patricia, another important thing is privatization. That was a commitment that was made when I was a candidate. And believe me, this is a struggle for us here. The way we have to do that is to face left-wingers. They make our lives hell. I'm not afraid of them. I'm really not afraid of them. So yes, we took that decision and we started putting together this privatization program in more than 60 sectors, mainly in 3 pillars: privatization, public-private partnerships, and concessions. We approved 72% of all packages that were proposed. and the 28% missing are new areas. And just so you know how important this project is, we're going to sell IMB Convention Center, the Exhibition Center, the Sambadrome, the Autodrome, as well as more than 1,200 real estate that will go to a bid, as well as IMB Convention Center. They will be negotiated in the Brazilian stock exchange market. IMB will still be a convention center. However, with this new investments, it will become way more competitive. With real estate investments, we also increased the potential of this real estate. Investment will be higher than 400 million real, so that this area becomes even more competitive. And for those of you who know our city, you know that congresses, seminars, entertainment, they bring more income to our economy. And that is why in several other parts of the world, that's what they do. The Autodrome will also be improved. It will be preserved. We will still have an agreement with the Formula 1, but it will no longer cost 90 million real to the Brazilian government. There will be a revenue, estimated revenue of 3 to 4 billion real with investments coming from foreign companies. There is also a great construction potential, will improve the Autodrome for Formula 1, Formula Truck, and other categories. Same thing will go about with other institutions, just like cemeteries, funerary services, buses, markets, grocery stores. You see, the state does not have to run markets or grocery stores. That's an absurd. Patricia, in this program, we're going to have clear rules. I mean, we do have to have debates. We have to open up the conversation with public hearings and others, but we need to abide by the rules we set. Public hearings are going about. We have a 72% rate of approval in these public hearings. About half of these projects have already been completed, and we're going to start the bidding process or the open offers services. That will mean that we'll have an immediate revenue of about 7 billion real in about 3 years, and 4 billion real savings, totaling 11 billion real for the city of São Paulo. I just want to remind you all that we have an estimation of 55 billion real for revenue in the city of São Paulo. So we're going to save 4 billion and have an income of 7 billion. We're going to have clear rules for investors. Potentials are well acknowledged, and we can only attract investors if we offer them a legal framework and support so that they do not have any kind of legal risk, and we have to offer interesting assets so that they may have a good ROI. We also want to support entrepreneurship. I know we're going to have more time to talk about that during the debate, but we are totally for entrepreneurs. We created Empreenda Fácil program. We foster these programs with Itaú, Santander, and Bradesco banks, as well as the Brazilian Caixa Econômica Federal. We offer microcredits for entrepreneurs that account for about $10,000 converted into real, and we created incentives and rules for them based on studies that were created by Sebrae and Endeavor Institute. We wanted to come up with an entrepreneurial environment in the city of São Paulo, and we are prioritizing the poor areas of the city, the East Zone, the South Zone, and the North Zone. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. I want to give the floor to Ambassador Roberto Jaguaribe. Can you give us some context on foreign investments in Brazil? I talked about 70 billion real revenue. We had 2 peaks in 2011 and 2014. But I know that these figures are quite difficult to understand. Could you please clarify these figures for us? and also tell us what is positive about Brazil in terms of direct investments and how can we move further. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. I want to greet the mayor, Mr. Candido, Mr. Arminio, and I think this topic is truly important. Although in several parts of the world, there is a lack of precision in terms of investment. And these figures you mentioned are correct, roughly. In Brazil, since the 19th century, we've been receiving lots of investments, and we've been fortunate enough to have a very significant flow of FDII. Over the past years, this figure reached up to $800 million. Along with the financial and statistics institutions in Europe, we get figures about investments that come from the European Union to Brazil. Brazil receives about 50% of European investments in Latin America. But what surprises us is that this figure is still higher than the figures we find in China, of course, except the United States. And it also happens the other way around. Brazil is the origin of nearly 70% of Latin American investments in Europe, and it is the fourth non-European country in Europe, behind the US, Japan, and Canada. These are complex figures, I know. The figures you mentioned, $70 million last year, is figures from the central bank in Brazil, but these figures are lower than the ones we met in 2014. With this economic and political volatility in Brazil that has influenced directly investments, we kept on receiving FDI. Back in 2015, we were the 17th preferred destination in the world. 2016, we became the 6th country. Therefore, the country is truly attractive, despite some environment circumstances. But investors, they do not invest anywhere if they do not have a deep and relevant research about the place where they're going to invest. I mean, they are no lay person, they are no lay people, they have information. And what attracts people to Brazil? First, the country's size. Brazil is a continental country in terms of its geography, of its demography, of its economy, natural resources, and Brazil is also located among the 10 Brazil is among the 10 greatest countries in terms of economy, GDP, and other factors, and that in itself is already a factor of attraction. We also have a history about investments that dates back to the 19th century. We have some legal stability and legal framework that is acknowledged by companies that have used to invest in Brazil. Of course, now we have to rationalize public policies and try to understand them, mainly in our economy, since these policies have improved our situation. We've been receiving so many investments. What is the benefit for the country? Well, if we have a focused strategy, if we know exactly what to do with this investment, then the impact will be even greater. And the current government has a huge deficiency in terms of infrastructure. As you may know, over the past 25 years, we've been investing 1.5 or 2% of our GDP, less than what was expected in our infrastructure, which created a deficit, and that actually limits our growth. One of our bottlenecks is infrastructure. Now, moving forward, we have so many challenges to face. Now, let me talk about Coastal Brazil. First, we have interest rates, labor costs, bureaucracy, especially in São Paulo, with the actions that were taken by the mayor. All these aspects are being taken care of and attacked. And of course, we still have a need to focus on tax issues, which is a very complex topic in Brazil particularly. And as far as I can see, it comes along with this tariffs rationalization, which is also a very complex process, and we do need to undertake a political reform. However, I think we have already set the ground, set the base for this reform. This specific government has particularly worked on forecasts and transparency for investors. Above all, in terms of concessions, that is going hand in hand with an independency from regulatory agencies. So all these elements are going forward. But I do think we need to coordinate the government's efforts with the private sector so we have more of a positive take on investments in Brazil. Thank you, Ambassador. Now let me hand over the floor to Mr. Candido Bracher. Candido, could you tell us a bit about investors' trust in Brazil? How do you see this context? Do you think we are regaining the attractiveness in this international context? And the second question is, how can we deal with institutional and political risks in the Brazilian context?
We were saying before that there would be a lot of convergence amongst the panelists here, but I'd never realized that would be so much. You have said half of the things I was going to say. First thing concerning investors' trust is the observation that despite the crisis we're going through, despite of the counter orders we have had, we have not lost investors' trust. As Roberto said, we have consistently been ranking amongst the 10 top investment destinations in the world, together with countries such as France and Germany. Consistently, we have been ahead of most of emerging markets, except for China. And a little of that, actually a lot of that, is the result of structural characteristics, as you have said. Our extension, the fertility of our soil, strategic agribusiness, the flexibility of our industry, the fact that we have highly qualified labor pockets, and also institutions' safety. We do have an efficient institutions when we talk about public management, as Mayor Doria mentioned, but they are solid institutions. They've been through a lot of stress with the presidential impeachment, with the car wash operation, but they have resisted in terms of independence and strength. Very briefly, consider in which of the BRICS countries would you rather have some property? Where do you feel that your property is guaranteed? For investors, think about that. And I think that this is the reason why Brazil has always kept this high standard amongst investors. Now, I think it also maintains that position because there's an investor's expectation that we will be capable of addressing our structural problems. And frustrated expectations, they usually grow tired. So what do we have to lose? Optimistically, we think of how investments can increase, but we may also lose investments if we do not look after some of the crucial elements that will ensure for investment. One such characteristic is macroeconomic stability, which is phenomenal. Given the 2 years of greatest recession, 15-16, and the recent history, we have maintained nearly $150 billion of investment. And we were expecting to recover that. And we have trodden a very good path, recovery path. Since 2016, when we started approving important reforms, such as the labor reform, such as the fiscal cap, increasing the TLP, the central bank's operation, which has become more transparent, more accountable. But it all goes to say that we have achieved macroeconomic stability, meaning we still have this fragility in fiscal terms. Public debt, which has been growing somewhat out of control. And dealing with this problem by means of the social welfare reform is a crucial condition for us to achieve this macroeconomic stability. And it's crucial for foreign investment. Foreign investors look at that. They will never go for investments on a moment drive. They do their search and they look for horizons, and we can actually offer this horizon if we address the fiscal issue. But that is not enough. I believe that if we do so, we will have afforded the countries with the conditions to grow constantly, but be at a mediocre level. For investment and for national investment, for any investment at all, predictability is crucial. Stability for rules and policies, we need to be able to offer all that. And a whole host of micro reforms. Mayor Doria has mentioned several micro reforms which are on the way in the state of São Paulo. We need that at the federal level as well. Our tax reform, for instance, it's been screaming to be engaged because our tax complexity is very high. So it's a major burden, a major blockade to investment. Training labor, which includes education, the secondary education reform, which we have just implemented, but it has not really taken off. We still need to bring about changes to the basic curriculum. That is going to help improve labor quality in Brazil, more politically than economically. Legal recovery reform, a whole host of reforms that will be able to afford investment with predictability. Therefore, we will be able to maintain this privileged position as far as foreign investment goes. And I don't think there's any solution outside of this recipe, which was not that original of a recipe. We have to have fiscal accountability, and we have to be working on micro reforms in order to achieve greater productivity. Thank you, Candido. I'll pass the floor to Arminio. In addition to your experience as an investor and also as a central bank president, if you could talk about this view on public finance and what challenge they may bring to capturing investment, also electoral investment, and lastly, the quality of investment. We can easily see that our exports matrix and even investments that are being made in Brazil, they still concentrate on low value-added products and services. Now, how can we change this perspective and the way those investments are made in order to add complex and value to the economy so that we'll be able to connect to the higher value global chains? Well, a lot of stuff, but I'm left with a short time. And I was leaving home early today. I talked to my wife. Well, they are giving me 5 minutes to expose my ideas. It just says, speak slowly. Yeah, it's an old one, but it's a good one. I am, the one who talks about the half-full glass. With all of the potential we have in Brazil, we do receive a lot of investments, despite major turbulence, which has been part and parcel of our lives. And the past 40 years, we have grown at the same rate as the US, which is a mature economy. So investing more, investing better, converging. So there's something wrong in the way we organize ourselves. And I think now is the time for us to live up to that reality. The challenge, therefore, has been clearly posed here, is the major governance challenge and also a challenge in terms of ideas. That's not only the political or moral issue, but a matter of ideas. Brazil is the most western of the BRICS countries, the large emerging countries. Capital cost is very high here, and that allows for secondary market investments. which is not a problem indeed. It drives up asset prices and it encourages investment indirectly, but it does. And mirroring that, despite all of the foreign investment, added investment is still very low in Brazil. It is hardly ever enough to replenish depreciation when it comes to infrastructure. As was mentioned before by the speakers before me, I believe that we have not been able to cover for depreciation, if we talk as Brazil as a whole. And this is a challenge. I see foreigners more optimistic than us. All of that money is coming from abroad, but overall investment here is very small. It's like arithmetical calculations. So mindsets are not so enthusiastic here. And everything points at the elections. Unfortunately, this far into the game, major projects tend to come to a stall. Investments have grown, but on very low basis. And the investments we're likely to see is in October, when we have a chance to elect a good president, and preferably after some debate that we'll be able to face our challenges, which are major challenges, coming towards the conclusion of my talk. In fact, we have not had to deal with our traditional problems of inflation and payroll, and that's due mostly to heavy duty work on the macro aspects. But also, given the depression we're going through, the central bank has made lemonade out of this lemon. On the fiscal side, some important reforms have been implemented on the micro side. On the macro side, however, the major one did not come into being, which is the social welfare reform. A cap has been set for expenditures, but no reform has been really implemented. This is a contradiction for the upcoming president in 2019. In addition to the macro and micro reforms, with which I fully agree, I would add state reform, because Brazil has a productivity problem, and that is a matter for the state. I do not champion minimum state, but our state needs to deliver, because it collects 1/3 of the GDP, and it eventually delivers relatively small return. And that calls for internal reforms here in Brazil. I know that the São Paulo mayor has been promoted this revolution. We can see some signs of that going on in other parts of Brazil as well, but by and large, it still represents a major challenge, but it is also a major opportunity. So in summary, and just for a change, our problems are usually internal problems. Foreign investors have given us benefit of the doubt, but we have not. And this is something that we have to get right. Thank you. Thank you, Arminio. We have covered a whole host of themes in our investment scenario with a focus on foreign investments in Brazil. There's an overall atmosphere of optimism when we have been receiving investments. We are one of the 10 countries that receive the most foreign investment. We have this more positive outlook outside than inside, but we have this eye on the macro and micro reforms. I would like to use this opportunity to get a feel of the audience, so we will now welcome some of your questions. So I'd like to have the microphone be distributed to the audience. Please raise your hands and be brief. If it's a specific question to any of the panel members, please address them or him. And please, before you speak, introduce yourself and state your role and your the entity you represent. If you don't have any questions, I have a whole series of questions myself. There comes the first question. My name is Silva Coutinho. I'm the president of the BS Bank in Brazil, talking about infrastructure, which is the driver for our economy, so that our economy can move forward. And I have been deeply engaged by means as the chair of the infrastructure working group with the Brazilian government. We have listened to a lot of foreign investors, particularly new entrants who had not been traditionally along with us. There have been major changes, major improvements, because the rules of the game now make sense and we are competing with other markets. So what we hear quite often is a strategic long-term vision, as has been mentioned by many of you. Foreign investors need to have a long-term horizon, particularly if you're looking at investing in infrastructure. So I would like to hear from any of you who would like to make your comments about it. How can we actually bring Brazil together along the issue and look at the competitive advantages? As a business, it is no doubt a competitive advantage service area. We are a large country. The industry is a challenge. We have some points of excellence. But infrastructure is a consequence of strategic view, the view of competitive advantages for the country. Ambassador, would you like to say something? I think everybody has something to say about it, but I would like to have a few more questions before we pass the floor to the panel members, so we'll bring a few more questions together. I concur. I think that the changes that have been implemented containing PPI, rationalization, I like this word because it represents the new flow of settling adequate public policies for the country. First, it was the democratic process, macroeconomic stability process, and then social inclusion. Without those processes, we cannot go anywhere. But it has to do with a fiscal limitation. And I do hope, I actually expect that to be settled on the part of the government, but with general acceptance as well. Now, in terms of increasing predictability, visibility, transparency, to give more time for the concession processes, listening to all potential stakeholders, and to accept arguments to a reasonable extent. Results have been self-evident. First, in the area of ports and airports, it's been a major success. We have not yet reached the fundamental area of transport and railroads, which is a major deficiency in the country. There are deficiencies in the projects we have. We need more consistency in those projects before we present them. Also, in the area of electrical power, we have achieved major success. For the first time, actually, a concession process, public concession, including solar energy prices that have been quite reasonable. We're not subsidizing renewable energy. We have observed a boom in wind energy, and there's a major potential. And many new players have come into the country on account of that. I have gone throughout the world with Apex and other entities, and I have observed great welcoming. And I am fully convinced that infrastructure is a driver for growth. And I concur with Arminio and Candido. Brazil should not be content to grow at 3% a year. In Martin Louv's words, in a conversation when he came to talk with us to the Financial Times. So you are satisfied. You're satisfied to reach the level of the United States and Europe. If we grow at that level, we are abdicating from that idea of getting to a higher level of investment and participation. Infrastructure is going to delimit, to create new words that will generate GDP in construction and also in terms of the impacts with the externalities. The sector that has been most affected is agribusiness. That's responsible for infrastructure deficiencies. That opens up a little possibility for me to say that Brazil is a major agro-environmental power with extraordinary sustainability to production, despite the distortions we have. I say that it's very easy to speak ill of Brazil, but we have to look at what we produce, really. Particularly when it comes to environmental terms, where there's lots of distortions. For 20% global growth, we have to increase production by 40%, and we are absolutely capable of doing that. And that area has been kind of disregarded, but it's been as much as it was because of science and technology investments. And it can significantly grow, so much so that I'm convinced that the measures being implemented now can keep a continuous improvement. But they have had considerable impact. We still need technical capacity building to develop our projects, and we certainly need a more adequate regulatory framework, which has been implemented, and also expedition in terms of license concessions, particularly when it comes to environmental issues. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Any other questions? Vinícius from Folha de São Paulo. A question to Candido, also with a little contribution from Arminio Fraga. Infrastructure investment is going to be limited, as we know, because of the fiscal crisis. If it's not going to be reduced in coming years, BNDES is going to be limited because of the known reasons. And we're going to have capital markets to fund companies, infrastructure, in places where there's no precarious market, which is not profitable. So we're going to have to go where the market would not. Now, there's money for that. The capital markets is going to be able to cover for that. We'll have the conditions because our capital markets, laid back for many reasons for a long period of time. But we'll have to recover investment in infrastructure, and we will have enough volume to invest in infrastructure and precarious areas as well, where there's not much return. Thank you very much for the question. It's a very easy one. I think the capitals market is going to account for a lot of stuff. If we keep abreast of what happened in 2017, the level of development of our capitals market was extraordinary. We grew in every area. Fixed asset profitability, share issuing, IPOs, merger and acquisition operations. We have grown in all of those areas. The major myth we had that the BNDES, as it withdrew from the market, investment would come to an end, that has not been proven. And I may see, as we look at the credit portfolio growth in this year, we see that credit for big companies is the one that grows the least because they have access to capitals market. And capitals market actually replaces the BNDES as well as the private banking system. There's obviously another factor, which is that capacity, meaning funding to major companies, they are connected to longer-term investment projects. And they are looking for longer-term horizons, and elections are a barrier in that sense. They expect until they have clear horizon before they make major efforts. And your question goes towards non-profitable investment, meaning the investments which do not fall within the time frame. Meaning not immediately profitable. Capitals market has had very long term because some companies issue shares which do not distribute dividends. So if you expect profitability within a time frame that you can see, I think there's some risk capital, venture capital that has to be included. But you have projects that need some kind of different support. In these PPP projects, for instance, I've seen elsewhere the state picking up the bill whenever there's an interest on the part of the state. I think this is a proposal for the BNDES, meaning they should be working on these segments with their expertise, obviously relying on transparent rules, with free access, with clear competition rules, factoring in profitability in those investments which have a clear social interest, where return cannot match the other
return by the other sectors of the market. Arminio, would you like to compliment? Yes, but perhaps I may not have much to say. You can speak slowly, she says. I think it is a fact that public finance in Brazil are going through a very severe crisis. We are not to expect much from it, but since the government still has a very big debt by issuing bonds to the market, which compete with those that would fund long-term projects, I do agree that the BNDES still has the scale to do what they should have been doing all along, which is to focus on those things that bring higher social return. If things do get better after elections here in Brazil, I believe we will see a lot more foreign money, more than we already have. And I think it might even become a problem from the exchange point of view. It's going to actually, put some pressure on other sectors. I do think the infrastructure should be a driving force for growth rather than an obstacle. Nevertheless, the market is going to develop because opportunities look good, provided we do not elect someone who will bring about uncertainty and instability. We still have time for one more question.
My name is Paulo from Wilson Center in Washington. Arminio, you mentioned different issues, especially in terms of deficit, the tax deficit. And you mentioned that this may be debated during the elections or the campaigns. And we know about different fears people have in terms of talking about these issues. Do you think we can maybe force people to debate upon that? And if so, if tax reform, for instance, or the social welfare reform, it is not popular, but it is needed. I mean, how can we make people talk about it so that whoever the candidate wins, they will actually put this into place? Well, I guess as long as we have a public debate, we'll be fine. In Brazil is a country where we have freedom of speech, we have an active press that investigates, that demands results, and I rely on them. I think that's what we have. I mean, it is quite easy to not talk about these issues, especially if we think that PT, which is the Workers' Labor Party, who destroyed all these values we're talking about, won't be there for the second round. If PT, some candidates from PT were elected, we can actually tell what went about. Now, if not, people get kind of lost in the way. So yes, we do have to rely on people just like you yourself, and people like us who try to do our share. But things are not going to be easy, but I'm still hopeful. I am kind of afraid because if we go towards even a lighter version of what went about back in 2014, then when time comes to put everything in place, then things will be even harder. Ambassador, do you want to say anything? Well, I guess when it comes to the social welfare reform, that is something that cannot go back. It is something we cannot postpone anymore. It is not a long-term issue anymore. So we do have to face that. My take on that is that at the end of the day, every single politician wish social welfare reform were approved way before, but none of them is prepared to take upon their shoulders the burden of this lack of popularity. So how can such a fragile government have been so strict like the government we have today? Well, they did it because it was impossible not to do so. And I think that's how things evolve naturally. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I must say that I agree with Vinicius. In Brazil, we always feel like we're solving problems that emerged 20 years ago. Everything that has to do with foreign investment and economic development had to do with technology, with labor, with social issues, and we are still running behind many of the things that we should have done in the past. So we're trying to make up for our historic gap. São Paulo is an island in Brazil. Many of these issues that we are debating upon, question, Mayor, is can you include social inclusion, technology, and innovation in your agenda? Patricia, social inclusion is of the essence. It is truly important. We cannot give our back to the social issues. Of course, we can foster economic development, but we do have to come up with a clear program for social issues. It will be truly difficult for a center-winged candidate to actually impact and win the elections if we do not understand that we do have to tackle social issues. Otherwise, it will become a left-winger or right-winger populist speech. And on the second shift, we'll have two extremists, Ciro Gomes, a left-winger, and Bolsonaro, a right-winger. And I'm sure that many of you who live in Brazil would not like to have either one as your president or as your grandchildren's president. When it comes to income and job creation, we need to have a clear, objective project. And it's not only about developing the country economically. When it comes to social inclusion, we need to have a clear program. Of course, we need to think of assistance programs, but we need to come up with programs that allow people to go from assistance to job creations and income creation. And we, in the state, we can do that. We can also do that on a federal level, in the state level, and in the city levels. And by doing so, as we create jobs, as we create new opportunities, I think, Arminio, that will increase trust and there will be hope. Maybe you can be even more hopeful that we can actually have a center-winged alternative that has a very clear and objective goal. We cannot use difficult language, speech that is not understandable by the majority of the Brazilian population, classes C, D, and E. We do have to use the television and the election debates so we can actually convince people and excite them about the future. Still, on that note, we have to value the social welfare reform, and I truly agree with Mr. Jaguaribe. That is something that may even not be voted up until the end of this year. But if not, then our next president, if he or she is responsible enough, after 90 days that they take over the government, they should put that into a vote. Let me give you two examples. I think these examples will serve as an inspiration for you all. Candido, we launched the PGT, the Labor Creation Program. And in several areas of this city, we provide them with incentives in terms of taxes so as to create new jobs. They had to create about 50% of new jobs for those who lived in that neighborhood so as to reduce the community problems, to value those areas where unemployment rates were higher. That's what we did in the east zone of São Paulo, Zona Leste, where more than 6 million people live. We launched this program 12 months ago, in March last year. And we invited the first company to take part of this challenge. The name of this company is Atento. And in the beginning of last week, I was fortunate enough to open up the new department of Atento. 12 months later, they created 3,500 new jobs. And in about 60 days, we're going to have 3,500 people working. And it's amazing to see those people who live in the east zone of São Paulo, people who are very happy to be working for a technology company, for a contact center company. There is a low, they do not need to have a great educational background, but for those people who had no hopes at all, earning 1,100 real a month, plus healthcare plans, plus food aid, transportation aid, that is something that actually changes these people's lives, and it is the opening gate for the job, for the market. All it took was to plan for a specific industry, and contact centers were the first, one of the first industries that responded to our calls. Atento is an open capital company from Spain, and they actually want to expand that area based on our project. Since now that the economy is growing, they want to expand and increase the number of jobs created. Again, these are small examples just to inspire you all. In the city chamber today, we had many protests from PT, from PSDB, and different left-wingers parties. We managed to approve the first part of the municipal social welfare program, and next week we're going to approve. We did not hold back. We approved this project, and only this year we'll save 4 billion real in our city. Employees will have to contribute 3% of their income. So the issue here is an issue of ideology. And that's why strong governments, the ones that are determined, they can carry out this project. Since retirement plans do not destroy jobs, we create jobs and we improve people's lives, either those who work in the public sector or in the private sector. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. We are running out of time, and I have one final provocation for you. In your final remarks, I would kindly ask you to talk about your #1 priority going towards the future. We talked about micro reforms, macro reforms. A lot has been said about the context, about a new revolution, a new change in public policies. We talked about the social welfare program, about tax reform. We talked about business environment, how to create jobs. We talked about social inclusion. Now, looking forward in this new world where technology is coming into place, where 70% of all the jobs that we have today will no longer exist in 10 years. We have to look at the future. Brazil is such, a country with such a great potential. We have to change the plane's engine as the plane flies, right? We cannot stop. We have to provide investors with stability. We have to provide Brazilians with another new dream. So again, #1 priority, going towards the future so we can build our dream. And wrap up our talk with an aspirational take. Thank you, Mr. Arminio. I want to be first, because as you know, I have to leave a bit earlier. We haven't talked about security yet. I would include that into the discussion. And I think nothing will work if we do not have high-quality education, right? So I want to thank you all. I apologize, but I have to go. Mr. Mayor, thank you very much. Mr. Candido. Well, as I heard what was said here and how important it is for us to have this concept in concrete terms, such as fiscal stability, macroeconomic stability, which is often seen as boring topics, I think we have to focus on jobs. Moving forward, we have to create jobs. And to do that, to have sustainable jobs, we need education. Because as you said, jobs are changing. half of jobs we have today will no longer exist in about 15 years. And therefore, jobs will only be sustainable if individuals are well trained and prepared. So I think this is our #1 priority, to create new jobs. Well, I fully agree with everything has been said here. Education, job creation are of the essence, and I have to insist on social inclusion. No consistent country lacks social inclusion. It has to do with our function, and that's something that is needed by the country. But I think the political reform is the most important element that needs to be undertaken. We cannot do the same thing over and over again and expect to have different results, right? And that is why we need to have a political reform, so that all the other reforms can come further. I think this would be the mother, so to speak, of all the reforms. Patricia, we are actually 4 minutes ahead of time. Excuse me, late. I agree with Mr. Arminio and Candido. I don't mean to disagree with Ambassador Jaguaribe, but if I had to choose, I would say jobs and income. This is what we need for people so that we can actually change. But of course, education is needed. Education is pivotal. And also, of course, professional education. Experiences in São Paulo, such as the one we've had with Governor Alckmin in the FATECs, the technical schools and technical universities. People who take 90-day courses, they get a job way easier. So this qualification has helped many, many people in São Paulo to get a new job. So again, new jobs and income, of course, with a good public education and professional education. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.